Welcome. Thank you for joining. Today's SuperWebinar Supply Chain Series Part 3. The fourth part is happening in April. Thank you for taking time out of your day to join us. We're thankful to Human Powered Solutions for partnering in this educational series, not only keeping the industry informed on the current status of the supply chain, but also highlighting areas in which retailers and the industry alike should be looking to pivot to continue to find success and profitability. I'm going to turn it over to Jay in a minute, but I'd like to take a moment to mention the NBDA Bicycle Buying 2021 Consumer Research Study that is now available for pre-order on the NBDA website. This is an invaluable planning tool reference guide for suppliers, brands, and retailers alike to shape your strategic and business planning around understanding the consumer buying and e-bike buying habits over the last 2 years. As I mentioned, the version for association members, brands, and suppliers is available now for pre-order. We'll have a version for retailers coming next month. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Jay to take it from here.
Oh, thank you, Heather. Thank you, Rochelle. First of all, welcome everybody. This, as Heather has mentioned, is the fourth in a series. And we've got, is the third in a series, and we have the fourth coming up. You'll see the dates here on the title slide. Supply chain nightmare. When we first envisioned this, we thought that as we would be talking to you winter of 2021, December 21st, that we'd be nearing the end of the pandemic and looking also at a clearing up of the whole of the supply chain issues that we have seen. It turns out, as I prepared for this webinar, that we were not at that point, and in fact, it has changed dramatically. This is going to be as factual a presentation as we can bring to you, particularly for bike shops from the standpoint of a takeaway. And it will also be longer than we normally do for these webinars. So I'm advising you that if you've got questions as we go along, use the facility in Zoom to get that question to Rochelle. We'll probably have 10 minutes at the end for Q&A, but please get your questions into Rochelle, because if there's any questions we don't get to in the formal Q&A session before the hour ends, Rochelle will send them to me, and I will make sure I answer those questions in detail for each and every one of you. For today's agenda, we are going to take a look at the bullwhip effect, which for some of you that has been following these webinars with us, we explained it, but we'll go back over it because it's become extremely important to the process. We're going to look at the bicycle supply chain, the order and forecast flow, which, by the way, is changing. We definitely will look at supply chain logistics and what we refer to as the rolling definition of normal, because there's no going back and there is no normal anymore. It's a rolling normal that changes and shifts with the disruptions that are popping up. We're going to look at the rise of inflation, which is tied or intertwined with the supply chain. And we think it's extremely important to explain that and to point out the ramifications. The nature of inflation has changed. What economists refer to as inflation 30 years ago and how it affected the economy 30 years ago, 20 years ago, even 10 years ago, has changed appreciably what occurred because of the ramifications of the pandemic. We're going to look at the Omicron variant, the era of predictable unpredictability, because what's occurred here is what we thought would be wrapping up the pandemic has now led to a continuation of the pandemic, which is affecting everything relative to the supply chain. And as I said, we will end with a question and answer session. And for those of you that do not get your questions answered, please put them in writing to Rochelle, and we will make sure they get answered after the webinar. The bullwhip effect. Oh my goodness. At the end of 2020, Dr. Brent D. Williams published an article titled "Slow Pedaling: How the Pandemic Affects Bicycle Supply Chains Now and Later." Now, Dr. Williams is an Associate Dean for Executive Education and Outreach and the Garrison Endowment Chair in Supply Chain Management at Walton College, University of Arkansas. The key here is that He is the chair in supply chain management. He is an expert in the field. He's also an avid mountain biker. So he's one of us in that context. Now he references rationing and shortage gaming, something that's extremely important for all of us on the webinar to understand. And I'll repeat that. Rationing and shortage gaming is one cause of the bullwhip effect. And he points out that the idea is that when faced with known shortages, really retailers may game the system by placing inflated orders. You guys wouldn't do that, would you? Now, while it might seem logical to retailers, shortage gaming can create further supply chain problems, which is the whole point here. As Dr. Williams points out, if brands and manufacturers view the orders from retailers as real, demand from the standpoint of the consumer, which they're isolated from, so I'll repeat that. If the brands and manufacturers view the orders from retailers as real demand, they may overproduce, leading to excess inventory in the supply chain. In our case, if the distributor brand views the retailer orders as being real, they'll pass them on to the OEM in Asia to manufacture. This causes brands or retailers to hold too much inventory. Now, brands can control gaming by allocating inventory as it becomes available. We've seen some of that in the market, going back to the old bike boom, the original bike boom in the 71, 74 period. That's exactly the way Schwinn reacted to the demand. Schwinn allocated product. However, both the gaming of the system, that is inflating orders, which is the bullwhip effect, and the allocation of orders will make forecasting sales for demand very, very difficult moving forward. Brands and manufacturers use sales history to forecast future demand, and they plan their capacity accordingly, as do the OEMs. But sales history from 2019, 2020, and 2021 is highly unlikely to accurately predict sales in the future. I took this from the New York Times, found it extremely interesting. On November 30th, Megan Sifos, shown here, is basically been hoarding sneakers in Connecticut. Now, I couldn't find any references directly to specialty bike retailers, but Megan owns a running shop. In fact, she's the owner of 2 running shops in Darien and Ridgefield, Connecticut. And they'd normally have about 3,000 pairs of shoes in stock ahead of the holiday season that we're going through now. But as she watched supply chain concerns in Vietnam, where the vast majority of running shoes are made, she looked at what was happening through the summer in Vietnam and into the fall of the year, and she secured a new storage facility and is now carrying about 4,100 pairs. She admits readily to the New York Times it's a costly gamble. She has said that she's extended now to about $165,000 more than she would typically be extended financially in November, because she's worrying about the potential shortages. And this is a quote from her. It's placing a big bet and anticipating that what all of the analysts are saying is correct. She's placing a big bet based on what the analysts have predicted. She also says, usually we get through the New York Marathon and then we stop buying shoes. We sell off what we have and go into January super lean. But we're being told not to do that because there's just not going to be any shoes available. The buildup of running shoes in Connecticut is just one example of how supply chain woes and pandemic-related shortages are affecting thousands of small businesses around the United States, including bike shops, as we prepare for the holiday season. And I thought I would add this because it's very similar, I'm sure, to what's occurring with many bike shops, especially bike retailers in the United States. Supply chain problems have small retailers gambling. Now, the New York Times refers to this as hoarding. I'm not sure if it is. I would beg to differ. And we'll talk about a different version as we get further into this webinar. And by the way, I apologize in advance for my whining dog in the background because she would like to be a part of this webinar, but at this point, I can't include her in the discussion. Many of you have seen this before. This is a graphic that you'll see featured in most of these webinars as we move through the last three. This is an accurate depiction of the U.S. bicycle supply chain that includes bicycles and e-bikes, and additionally shows the order and forecast flow at the bottom. If you look down here, we've got the orders, the forecast flow, and the order flow, and then the supply chain itself as it works its way back through to retailers. The American consumer is the driver of the whole supply chain from beginning to end. And it's shown at the far right of this illustration, which I think we've got our speakers probably covering. And what I can do is, sorry, I didn't mean to take you out of the proper view here. What I was going to do is eliminate this, but since I can't, I'll just keep driving forward. It's to the far right. We'll show it in more detail on the next slide, or the next two slides. What you see in this particular rendition of the supply chain is the current situation at the end of December, as we see it right now. And what you see here is some added boxes using my cursor, the component inventory build at the OEM side. We have been told by OEMs in Asia that they are jamming their warehouses full of the componentry they can get, including the substitutions that have become quite popular. The finished goods inventory, as we get from the Asian ports into the shipping situation, is full. And we'll show you how that actually extends across now to about 100 days. And then lastly, the inventory is building at fulfillment centers, warehouses, brand warehouses, and at retailers. Now, not every model, but the bulk of SKUs are in stock and available for demand orders. So with this situation, we also wanted to take a look at what's changed or shifted in the whole of the environment. And the big question, and I'll repeat this several times, when we started putting this webinar together 20 days ago, that the 1st of December, was what effect the inventory build would have on retailers if the consumer demand began to ebb. What has changed today on the 21st of December is the Omicron variant has reared its ugly head. I apologize for my cat running across the screen. My animals are going crazy today. The Omicron variant has reared its ugly head. And 10 days ago, we were worried about the inventory. Today, we're going to look at the Omicron variant, the impact it's going to have on the consumer. We're going to look at inflation. And we're also going to add to the mix, will the Omicron variant have the same impact that the original pandemic when it hit in March of 2020 have on the bicycle market? Will it increase demand, in other words, as opposed to inflation suppressing it? So there's been some added things here that we have to add into the mix. I've used added several times that we have to consider in the mix as we move forward. I want you to consider this very carefully. This is from December 20th. This is like yesterday. And this is from the Financial Times. For those of you that don't get it, this is a British publication. I use it because it covers the North American market in the United States, I think very well from the standpoint of financial input and information. Look at this headline: supply chains. Companies shift from just in time to just in case. How many of you have heard of this? And from the standpoint of just in time, JIT, this is a time-honored methodology that goes back to the early 80s. And it comes from Toyota and from the Japanese and from a fellow named Deming, who is an American, who brought the whole concept of just-in-time management of manufacturing and inventory and even retail stock to first the Japanese and then to the American businesses. So the bicycle industry has followed just-in-time inventory management, just-in-time ordering, just-in-time forecasting, and just-in-time manufacturing for decades. But now what we see is this shift to just-in-case inventory, a new concept that evolved during the pandemic and simply means that you build inventory at retail, at wholesale, you build inventory across the pipeline because the disruptions that you cannot see, the unforeseen, unpredictable things are going to cause disruptions to result in shortage of supply. And with the consumer demand continuing and consumers wanting merchandise, we have to make sure that we have inventory just in case there's a disruption so we can serve the consumer instead of just in time, which was a well-oiled machine across the bicycle distribution and supply chain from Asia to the United States for the last 30 years. Now, 30 years ago, up through 2019, when a purchasing manager for a brand in the United States said, okay, it's time to make my forecast a firm order. And so I pushed that button. The plant already had my forecast. They'd made the adjustment. There are rules that were followed relative to the way that worked and how the manufacturing flowed through. And so I was all prepared. I had got my componentry into my warehouse because I knew that a forecast would become an order within a reasonable percentage of the size of that forecast to the order. It would not be allowed to be too big or to be reduced too much. So when I pushed that button, it was 40 to 45 days from the OEM through the supply chain to the warehouse. 40 to 45 days based on the forecast programs that have been set up for under the just-in-time philosophies and the just-in-time policies. This whole process was so ingrained that in Taiwan, the Taiwanese bike industry formed a group called the A-Team. And the A-Team included, at one time, the NBDA. It included the Bicycle Product Supplier Association in the US. It included suppliers and brands. And the whole idea was that annually, the Taiwanese industry would take a group of their component manufacturers and their bicycle manufacturers and take them to Japan for several weeks to specifically study at the Toyota plant, which Shimano arranged, by the way. They studied at the Toyota plant to learn firsthand about the JIT system throughout, from OEM manufacturing to the wholesale houses. So that 40 to 45 days was something that we were used to in the industry. Come the COVID, come the disruption, starting in I say 13 March 2020, others say 20 March 2020. This is current from December. And what it shows is a charting of the average time ocean cargo takes from exporter's gate, that is from the OEM's gate, to the destination port. And this is the trans-Pacific eastbound. So this would be from Asia to the ports of LA and Long Beach. And look at the bottom. Here's your was the typical 40 to 45 days. July 2019, January 2020, July 2020, January 2021, July 2021, and up to the current quarter, and this is 100 days. So that 40 to 45 days from the time I push the button, the purchasing managers, the marketing managers, the product managers, the senior managers are now looking at 100 days on average relative to the time it takes for that product that I have forecast and firm ordered to get to the destination port. And now there's certainly other delays in the destination port to take into account. Now, this will all change from the standpoint of up or down. We just don't know which direction now because we have another variant of the coronavirus to deal with that's being absorbed in the systems and will have an impact on both supply, on the transportation, and on the delivery and distribution in the United States. Now, despite that, retail cargo imports are nearing a record pace, despite the port congestion, despite the delays in transit, despite the 100 days, because the whole of the process is dependent upon what the consumer is doing. It's all about the consumer. And the consumer at this point, as we'll see, has continued to buy merchandise, to demand merchandise, to purchase merchandise. They want goods. And what's occurred here, those of you that have been in these webinars before have seen this, I'll make it quick. This is the monthly change in retail spending since January of 2019. Here's that demand from consumers. Here's January 2019 to January 2020, when the COVID hit. There's two lines here. The dark line is the OECD countries. That is, it's an organization of economic countries, of big countries and small countries that are a basket. And then you got the light line, which is the US. And look what's occurred here through 2021, going into June of 2021, is consumer demand relative to retail spending has increased and continued to increase. Now, this is for all types of retail demand, which includes online and brick and mortar, but it emphasizes that the demand of the consumer is what's driving this process, and in turn has a great deal to do with why we've got the delays that we've got, because the demand for merchandise has continued to increase. And within that increase, consumers have shifted their spending from goods or to goods from services. As consumers could not move about, as they were confined, there were stay-at-home orders, they could not get to restaurants, which were shut down. There was no longer the entertainment venues available. So what happened from February of 2020, when the COVID hit, is these three lines represent: the light line is spending on services, the middle line is spending on all services and all goods, and the top line is spending on goods alone. And what occurred coming out of the COVID hitting the country and the pandemic was the demand for goods and spending on goods increased and continued to increase as the availability and demand for services declined. And this is through August 2021. So it's all about supplying consumers. In turn, the supply chain that had been fine-tuned, honed, and gotten used to, or was complacent in, the just-in-time system, all of a sudden was hit with a shock. And that was more demand. So what is the world supply chain like? Well, we know what the bicycle manufacturing piece is in the United States, primarily in China. We've shown that before. We're an import-dependent market in the US. From the standpoint of transportation, there are in round numbers 6,000 container ships that are available for all of the world trade routes. Now, there's been some ships added. There are ships added every year. There's some ships that have been taken out of service, some ships that have been brought back into service. Round numbers, 6,000 container ships. This, by the way, is an aerial view of the port of Los Angeles. There are 25 million shipping containers that are available and in circulation in the world to go on to and be transported by these 6,000 container ships to the ports of the world. These are 20-foot containers, 40-foot containers, 40-foot high boys, containers of all sizes. So when they back up in one place and there's problems with getting empties moved back across the Pacific Ocean to the ports and OEMs in the Asian source countries, there's 25 million shipping containers in the flow around the world. And part of the orchestration here is to get these 6,000 ships and these 25 million containers all moving in the same direction to get the goods to where the demand is focused. And in our case, in the United States, ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach are 40% of US imports into this country. Now, you've all read about what's happening with freight rates. They're moving through into your costs. They're moving through into inflation. What this chart shows, and the piece you should be most interested in, is the China, East Asia, North American, East Coast. I'm sorry, West Coast, the bottom line, the gold line. China, East Asia, North America, West Coast. And when we look at that line, going back to the fourth quarter of 2020, prices were below $5,000. In fact, they were below $4,000 in many cases. You've heard this story before. As we look at Q4 2021, we're somewhere above $15,000 for that same container. They haven't changed. It's 25 million containers on 6,000 container ships that were moving through the ports at below $4,000 in circulation per container back in 2019. And that shot up in some cases to $20,000 for that same container to go on that same container ship. You'll notice that these lines are coming down because some of the rates are changing, they're dropping. What occurred here is the major lines, particularly led by Maersk, which has got 1 in every 5 containers in circulation in the world, froze prices for 5 months. Through February of 2022, through Chinese New Year. And they froze prices at a relatively high rate. Now, what's happened here, this is from November 15th. It became obvious that and this headline reads, sky high container shipping prices may be coming back to earth. And this is according to the Baltic Index. And this is for what we're interested in, what's Trans-Pacific rates. They fell at the fastest pace in 2 years in early November. This is true. Rates have come down, but they came down from the highs of 20 to 15,000 to into the 11 to 10,000, in some cases $9,000 range. However, up from below 4,000. So they're still at very high costs that are being passed through as additional costs from the brands and manufacturers who are paying that to get their containers into the US, to the retailers, to you, the specialty bicycle retailers, or to any of the wholesalers that happen to be on the call. Now, the other thing that's occurring here as the rates have come down, it's the shipping lines knowing that some of the volume is off. The monthly year-over-year percentage change in combined loaded containers coming into the US at the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach have come down, and we can look again with the cursor, January 21, you see this peak and another peak again. And as we get toward November of 21, we've come to a negative, or the annual percentage change going to negative, going to negative to somewhere about 10% below previous levels as we look at this last month. So the prices have come down, the volumes also come down a bit, but there's still great pressure on the ports. I'll explain this in a bit, but there's probably there are over 100 container ships waiting to unload ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach as we speak. And of course, many of those have bicycle products on them, as well as lots of other goods. 100 ships is a lot of ships. The average has been 8,000 containers per ship, up to more like 11,000. I'll show you the increases in just a moment. I threw this in to emphasize that the container lines, the shipping lines, Maersk, OOCL, Evergreen, have not done too shabbily during this pandemic and during the disruptions. What this chart shows and this is from December 2nd of this year, is the combined operating profit for container shipping lines worldwide in the third quarter 2021 is nearly equal to the entire combined operating earnings for all the carriers from 2010 to 2020. The combined operating profit for container shipping lines worldwide in the third quarter of 2021 was $37.24 billion. I'll just leave you with that thought. Now, the queue I mentioned. The West Coast ports have agreed back in November, this is from mid-November, November 12th, to a queuing system where the Long Beach port congestion is going to be not shown. What this means is that all of the federal, state, local authorities have agreed on the West Coast covering the ports of LA and Long Beach that ships coming to the ports will slow down about 1,000 miles out in the Pacific. They will start anchoring at 150 miles from the ports. This provides better optics, quite frankly, so that the news media isn't seeing these constant pictures of all these ships, 70 of them on average, waiting outside these two ports to get in to unload. So what you've got now is about 30 ships waiting to get into the combined ports, the twin ports of Long Beach and Los Angeles, and over 100 container ships that are strung out from 150 miles away from the ports or away from the West Coast of the United States, back, about 1,000 miles from the United States, nautical miles. Right now, what that's leading to is what's called blank sailings. A blank sailing is simple. It's on the schedule. The steamship line says that a vessel is going to pick up goods on such and such a date. A blank sailing means they struck it. They pulled it off the schedule. They didn't load it. What's occurred because of this 130, 40 plus backup in ships to the West Coast is at the Asian side, the shippers are now increasing blank sailings, and it's hit 28% as of, I'm looking at the date here, December 15th. 28% of the scheduled shipments from Asia have been taken off the schedule because of the backup from mid-Pacific into the US ports. And that will continue as long as that backup continues. Now, part of the reason that's occurred that isn't talked about much is what this headline says. Cargo ships are so stuffed that ports are struggling to unload them. What's occurred here is a cargo ship, as I said, average was about 8,000 cans or containers. And the steamship lines have figured out at these higher costs. Now, this could be out of the goodness of their heart to get more ships in movement. But I like to think it goes to, well, they figured out that at $9, $10, $11, $12,000 a container, if you put more on a ship, you make more money. Let's cut right to the chase here. Relative to our rolling definition of normal, this is a chart that shows the percentage increase in average containers per ship from the first half of 2019 to the first half of 2021. Vancouver, Rotterdam, Antwerp, and Hamburg are interesting. You can see Los Angeles, 18% increase in the average number of containers per ship. And Long Beach, a 73% increase in the average number of containers per ship. That means despite the fact that the federal government got involved and we've now got a commitment for working longer hours, for staying open 24/7, for getting the trucks in more frequently to take the loaded containers out and get them to the warehouses and get them to the customers. The problem is the ports were handling a level of containers prior to that occurring that's now been added to, in the case of Long Beach, a 73% increase on average per container ship relative to the number of containers that need to be handled, offloaded, and put on caissons in order to be trucked out of the port to the receiving warehouse of the customer. Now, all of this is churning as we get to the fact that within the ports themselves, you heard this before, this is from November 23rd, the average number of days that containers leaving the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach by truck wait for transport, and this is from October, is 7.64 days. In other words, 8 days, and that's what the current wait is. A container gets offloaded from the ship, gets put into the container yard at the port, and will wait there on average 7.64 to 8 days before it's picked up and moved to the warehouse. So this is another area that you've got congestion and backup within the ports, and the moves to move from ports of LA and Long Beach up north towards Seattle to San Francisco to Oakland have certainly occurred, but those ports have quickly become pushed beyond capacity because they have not expanded facility. And some ships are being diverted from the West Coast through the Panama Canal around to the East Coast. So the ports of Savannah, the ports on the East Coast all the way up to New Jersey and New York have increased. But all of this is still creating a logjam and a backup because of consumer demand. Consumers want more stuff. Brands manufacturers are trying to provide that stuff. They're loading up container ships to the capacity plus 76 or 73% more containers in order to get them into the ports. They're trying to work those containers, get them through the warehouse process, but you still have a wait of about 8 days in the port. Another piece that I've mentioned before that goes to the plant side of the equation is the backup that's occurred at the plants or the shutdowns of manufacturing facilities that make bicycles because of an energy crisis in China. Now, what's occurred here is partly self-induced. Because the central government of China wants to reduce pollution, which means they've got to shut down or reduce the use of coal-fired power plants, they have to ration electricity. Now, it isn't because there's a shortage of electricity, it's because they want to reduce the amount of coal that's burned to produce that electricity. So what we looked at here is these are all of the provinces of mainland China. In dark color, the provinces are identified where they have had limited electricity or electrical use to everybody, the population, the plants. We've identified on the right the 5 provinces and the 1 municipality that the bicycle and e-bike industry is centered in mainland China. And so we can see here that Tianjin municipality, by the way, this is near Beijing, where a lot of bike frames are made, has not experienced any problems with power shortages. However, all 5 of the manufacturing centers, Sichuan province, Jiangsu, Zhejiang, Fujian, Guangdong, all have experienced limited or limiting electricity to the plants, and therefore there have been these power outages, which mean shutdown of manufacturing for a period of time, some short, some long. Now, geographically, so you can get oriented here, Guangdong province, this is Hong Kong Harbor where my cursor is, and Taiwan is right here, right offshore. This is the Strait of Taiwan outside of Fujian province, or across from Fujian province. So this is an added piece that is off and on. Now we're going to spend a little bit of time just looking at the ramification of all of what I've presented to you relative to both delays, but every piece of this is rising cost. It's increasing costs through the pipeline. It's resulted in US inflation hitting a 31-year high in the month of October as consumer prices jumped to 6.2%. That, by the way, went to 6.8% in November. So we've had this spike in inflation. Now, I will point out that there's a number of reasons for this. It starts primarily with all these increased costs. These price increases in cost have moved through the pipeline. You know that they have been affecting bicycle retail pricing. I've heard as many as 3 or 4 price increases in the course of this year alone. And certainly there will be more price increases if this continues, and it looks like it will for a period of time. However, if you back up, this is a new kind of inflation. It's a kind of inflation that has not been seen before because we have not had the stimulus to the consumer and to businesses because of the pandemic in this country before. Yes, there were stimuluses back when we had the great crash in the housing market and the crash of the stock market back in the early 2000s. But this was different. The pandemic caused a situation where economic stimulus was moved several times into the economy: cash, money, the ability to spend on manufacturing goods, consumer goods, the ability to take this cash and use it to retain employees and to pay people, all of it moving into the economy and helping all coalesce into and move to a different type of inflation. I mention that because the stock market has remained strong. The US economy has remained strong as inflation has risen to these levels, 31-year highs, and we haven't seen a converse effect on the economy itself. We haven't seen a drop in the state of the economy or the economics of the US yet. Now, what is inflation? Inflation is a loss of purchasing power over time. That's for you, me, everybody, including retailers, wholesalers, manufacturers. It means your dollars will not go as far tomorrow as it did today. There's 2 ways that's expressed in the US that we see. Just please be aware, you should watch for the Consumer Price Index or the CPI. The other method that's used for measurement that we'll see in the press is the Personal Consumption Expenditures Index, or the PCE. Now, who's to blame for inflation? We've just seen the whole process of delay, the whole process of disruption within our supply chain, and how prices have increased and moved through to the price of bicycles, components, accessories, how it's affected retail and how it's affected the consumer. But if you look at this pragmatically, the great shift in Americans' purchasing and employment practices have been prompted by the pandemic, and they look like the primary culprits in this round of inflation. This great shift in Americans' purchasing and demand and the employment situation. And then you could add to this the decisions by the administration and the Fed likely contributed, including the stimulus, which was extremely important and was needed. But this was not a case, we think, where the decisions by the administration or the Fed were the primary cause or the primary reason. Add to this the early decisions by the importers of bicycles and importers in general of goods into the US that were made in 2019 in particular, which made it harder for the supply chain to react to the increase in consumer demand after March 2020. And we're not the only industry. This statement is true of many industries because many industries looked at the punitive tariffs of 2018 and reacted by reducing the importation of goods or the manufacture and importation of goods, not because of consumer demand or a drop in consumer demand, but because they were waiting to see how the administration in power then would resolve the punitive tariffs, and in turn, if they could get exemptions from the punitive tariffs. And they reduced imports. They reduced the product in the pipeline and the inventory available to meet demand. Now, despite all of this, looking at December 14th, The Bank of America's chief, its CEO, says consumers are spending at a faster rate than he's ever seen. So the bottom line again is it's all about the consumer. It's all about knowing what the consumer is doing. It's all about what Heather said at the beginning of this webinar, and that is the NBDA now has available and is sending to the sponsors and will have available for sale to the suppliers in the US bicycle business, the results of the NBDA consumer survey that was conducted in the month of November by Sports Market Surveys. And the dealer version will be available after the first of the year. So contact Heather, make sure you contact the NBDA, because there is available an in-depth research study of consumer buying habits over the last 2 years or during the pandemic, and a good idea of what the reaction will be moving forward into this third year of the pandemic. But right now, American consumers are spending at the fastest rate this particular bank president has ever seen in his career. Now, the Wall Street Journal, as part of covering this expansive buying and demand by the consumer, reported on December 3rd in its supply chain strategies or logistics report about the Kent bicycle plant in Manning, Georgia. That is Bicycle Corporation of America. This is the only appreciable bicycle assembly operation in the United States. And I think it's important to note that the Wall Street Journal decided that they would use bicycles as an example to report on what they say are the shortages that drove up bike prices in the US by as much as, and what they report is bike prices went up by as much as 54% in September compared to 2019. We haven't verified that, but it gives you an idea of the impact of inflation on the immediate. And the Wall Street Journal went on to report on the supply chain issues limiting businesses' ability to capitalize on cycling's newfound popularity. And we think that's exciting because it bodes well for one of the probabilities for the future. And to wrap up, we've got to make sure we add to this mix this headline from yesterday. New York hits another daily coronavirus case record as winter surge upends holiday plans, live entertainment, and family reunions. What's occurred here is when, as I said early on, we looked at putting this webinar together on December 3rd or 4th. The whole idea of the just-in-time system was beginning to vibrate and change, but obviously shifted to a just-in-case system of inventory control and management. We still don't know what the financial ramifications of that are, by the way. But what overlaid on it by the time we got to today is a new variant of the coronavirus and a continuation of the pandemic. So the turmoil and bewilderment of the pandemic era, the new normal is already here. We're headed into the third year of the pandemic and its continuing impact on the US bicycle and e-bike supply chain. Asian source countries have a zero tolerance policy, and reported cases of the Omicron variant will undoubtedly result in production plant and port closings. So we're looking to future disruptions beyond February and Chinese New Year. The probabilities for 2022 now include continued shortages because of supply chain disruptions, continued strong consumer demand for all things bicycles and e-bikes. You see the contrast. This may happen. We don't know. As of today, dealers are reporting that retail sales have dropped to zero. Will the third year of the pandemic revive them? Don't know. We'll have to see. It's a probability. Declining consumer demand in the face of inflation and inflation-driven price increases. Will this in turn continue? Or are we going to see it move in the direction of increased demand? And then lastly, possible inventory glut and price discounting could be. That would have been certainly the more possible variant, the more possible probability, if it hadn't been for the fact that sadly the pandemic continued because of the new variant that could affect these other changes. So in summary, we've gone through the bullwhip effect. We've looked at the bicycle supply chain and order forecast flow, supply chain logistics, and the rolling definition of normal, which will continue to change, the rise of inflation, the Omicron variant very quickly, and the era of predictable unpredictability continuing. And I believe we have a little bit of time left for some questions. Yeah, we do, about 6 minutes, but we can certainly go from there. So, Rochelle, were there any questions that came into you during the course of the webinar?
We have one so far. Anyone who has a question can put them in the chat function of the Q&A, and we will get to them if we have enough time. If not, we will make sure to send them to Jay, like he said earlier in the webinar, and we'll make sure to get you emailed those answers. So the one that we have right now is the Los Angeles area ports get a lot of attention as a primary bottleneck. Assuming they're not running at max capacity prior to COVID, they'll catch up and are now being avoided. Will return to normal inventory be a trickle over time or a sudden glut?
You're assuming there'll be a return to normal. That is still not a given at this point. The ports, if you look at the infrastructure legislation that now has become law, there's a great deal of money to expand and renovate the ports and to do something that the Asian ports, particularly the Chinese ports, did because they're newer than our ports, and that is automate them so that they can handle more on a 24/7 basis. The changes that'll need to occur relative to the flow of goods into the country are all dependent on consumer demand, as I said. So if consumer demand begins to ebb, and again, there will be some good reasons for that, and there will be some bad reasons for that. Let's hope they're good, so that we get to a lower level of demand and a balancing between buying goods and services, so the consumer continues to spend for the sake of the economy, and it continues to spend on bicycle-related products. But the pressure on the ports ebbs as we get through this 100 and some odd day backup of ocean freight, as we get beyond the 8 days of backup to move a container off a port. The monies will be available from the federal government to the states and to the port authorities to build out those ports, to add more handling capacity, and more importantly, to automate the whole of that capacity in order to run more and to run through the 24/7 cycle. So I think it's going to be gradual. It'll take time to renovate, and you're also going to find a situation where over time, the pressure itself will abate. As I said, that can be for a good or a bad reason or in between. Let's hope it's for a good reason, and in turn, we get to what would be a steady flow with a higher handling capacity on the part of the ports themselves.
All right, one more question. Did I correctly hear you say that some shops are reporting 0 sales for December? Can you elaborate on that?
Well, Heather can join this conversation. We looked quickly at some of the markets on the West Coast, and we found that starting several weeks ago, foot traffic had dropped to nothing. Same thing with service volume, that it had backed off. So instead of waiting weeks, the service backup was days. and these are top shops for in the top 10 categories for some of the top brands. I asked Heather about this, and so she just reported to me this morning as we were talking prior to this webinar that, over to you, Heather.
Yeah, thanks, Jay. Yeah, it seems to be regional, but we have some retailers reporting, as Jay suggested, that traffic is down. Some retailers are reporting that bike sales are almost non-existent, but then we have some retailers on the flip side reporting the opposite. Overall trending sales numbers are down this month, though, over 2019 numbers. And Jay, I'll turn it back to you.
Okay, thank you. So what we've seen, again, this is anecdotal. This is, we've gone out and asked some dealers. It's got to be measured, but I don't know that there's really time to pick up much, because what's happened between the time I first asked Heather about this and she talked to a number of dealers is confirmation of the pandemic continuing. And so the effect of that is undoubtedly going to affect the consumer and the level of consumer demand. So the high consumer demand reported by the ports and by the president of the banks is an overall issue relative to consumer demand for goods. There's certainly the possibility that goods like sporting goods and bicycles in particular and e-bikes could be down, could be dramatically reduced. Within that same G, consumers are still buying stuff because they're buying different stuff. So that's one group of possibilities. What's changing all this, though, is will we see the reaction to the pandemic being like it was in April, May, June of 2020? And that is consumers wanting to socially distance, wanting to get out and exercise, wanting to get out with their kids, wanting to ride bikes. Will it affect repair shop volume, which in some shops is down? Will that go back up, which will put pressure on parts supply? Will it affect the demand for e-bikes? Will it affect the demand for bicycles? These remain as unknowns, but now because we've got the past history of what happened in 2020, it is a probability. It could be a resurgence. And of course, to quote Rick Vosper, or not. It's just, it's added. We didn't have it as a high probability December 3rd. We have it as a high probability now because of a very sad event. The COVID has continued.
I believe we have time for one more question, if that's all right with you, Jay.
Sure.
Perfect. If we're out of cash stimulus options during the next COVID wave, could we see poorer sales than pre-COVID normals?
That goes with the probability just discussed. Unfortunately, yes. There are no more stimuluses. There could be, but there don't appear to be any on the horizon. So there are no more stimuli that are in the system. And we have to also be aware that part of what the Bank of America president was reacting to was he's never seen this demand before, but part of that is because credit card debt has gone up and never been this high before. And at the same time, saving rates are at the lowest levels all of the major banks have reported in the last 2 years. So while there was stimulus, savings rates went up. And with no stimulus, what we're seeing is saving rates are being depleted and spent. And part of that spending is on credit card, and credit card debt is increasing. So we'll have to see how the reaction of in the economy is. So what you're describing is a probability at this point. Lack of stimulus leads to a reduction in sales demand.
Right,
so any other
that,
questions?
Yep.
Yep. Pass them on to me, Rochelle. I will get them answered before Christmas.
Perfect. And that email is info@nbda.com, or Jay's email listed on the screen right now. All right.
My cat came to help me, if you can see her ears here. Happy holidays to everybody.
Thank you. Thank you for being here.